Thank you so much for listening to Urbanistica podcast. I am Mustafa Sharif, an urban planner, and you're more than welcome to join my big journey of exploring the making of smarter and more livable cities. Please don't forget to follow Urbanistica on the different social media platforms, and also let's connect on LinkedIn. Big thanks to Urbanistica podcast partner AFRI. AFRI is an international engineering and design company providing sustainable solutions in the fields of energy, industry, and infrastructure. Are you ready for a new episode? Let's go for it. This episode is in collaboration with KTH, the Center for the Future of Places. And today we have a great story and a great storyteller. I have the pleasure to welcome you, Setha Low, to Urbanistica podcast. Hey, and welcome.
Nice to be here, even though I'm here in New York and way out on the end of Long Island. And I guess you're in Stockholm. Is that true?
Yeah, exactly. And now it's almost evening here. What time is it in New York?
Oh, here it's 10:40. Actually, it's it's March, and one of our first kind of almost spring days. It's 40 degrees Fahrenheit. You have to translate that for
Yes.
everyone. But the sun is out. There are no leaves or
Wow,
anything.
that's lovely.
Our weather's a lot like Sweden for your listeners. Maybe we get a little more snow and you get a little more rain. It's a little darker where you
Yeah.
are.
So, how are you, Setha? I hope you're doing good.
I'm good. COVID is a strain, COVID is different. COVID has really provoked me in many good ways to really think about the things I'm concerned about, social justice and public space. It's like uh, the most dramatic thing that will have happened to me in my lifetime. I mean, there have been dramatic things, it's true. 68 in May, I was in Paris, but this is really monumental and global. And I started out as a medical anthropologist. So I started out in Latin America studying health. And I used to wonder about how people live through plagues and how people live through great periods of disease. And I worked in hospitals in countries where people were very sick. So I had never really contemplated how a plague, an epidemic could change everything, especially in the area that we're interested in today, the city and public space.
Yeah. And now I would love that you take us even more back and tell us more about you. How would you like to introduce yourself? Tell us about how you grew up, your career. Just give us a highlight about Setha.
Okay. So I haven't had a very ordinary career in the sense that um, and my message to young people listening to this, you have to kind of go where life leads you because you really don't know what's going to happen. But many people would be surprised to know, since I think I have a New York accent at this point, that I was born in Los Angeles and I am a beach girl as a young person. But I never really felt at home on the west coast of California. I don't know if Swedes know about that or your audience, but it's a place where you're really supposed to be blonde, and I'm a brunette, and a surfer girl like Gidget. That's the world I grew up in. And to be an intellectual, which I was from very young, I was always interested in things. I would say that the most constant thing about me is tremendous amount of curiosity about the world. Absolutely, from very, very young, and particularly interest in how psychology or how we feel influences the world and how the world influences back. And I originally wanted to study, as I was saying, sort of the biological basis of behavior. which interestingly now is, something you can really study. Neuropsychology is really fantastic. But when I was a young person, it meant simply putting an electrode in cat brains. And so that didn't seem very appealing. But I was really interested in this sort of medical world, and something that was broad. So I began in college as a psychologist, biologist, based on this, and ended up being invited to go to El Salvador, that's in Central America, to be an archaeologist with a team of students. And this was 1969. I had already been to Paris and lived in Paris in 68 during the days of protest in Paris. I had been very young, I was like 19. I really mostly just helped other students. I mean, I was so kind of unaware of the politics of the moment and became pulled into it. But by the time I get to Central America in 69 and begin to work on an archaeological dig, I did begin to become interested in inequality and social justice. That's probably the first moment between Paris and El Salvador. Anyhow, archaeology didn't work out. It turns out I'm heat intolerant, and when I would dig on the top of a post-classic mound, I would pass out. So that took care of that career. So I went back to college and finished. Um, but I'd seen enough in El Salvador to become very interested in that there were other people living very different lives. Again, I had seen that in Europe. It was so different than California. And then I went to El Salvador. So I thought, well, I think I'll see more of the world. And I went to graduate school as a biological anthropologist. I decided I was going to study baboons in Africa. I was going to go and do animal ethology. Again, this interest in behavior.
You just don't want to stay at home.
No, I didn't want to stay at home. I definitely wanted to leave California. I didn't fit, and many anthropologists will tell you that there are people who somehow didn't quite fit. As I said, I was a little too intense intellectually, not blonde. I just wasn't, I was too intellectual. And for that kind of culture, I mean, LA is a lot about what you look like, not so much the world of the mind. And so I went to Berkeley, UC Berkeley, and was going to go and study baboons. And I wrote a paper about how we can understand baboons to understand human behavior better. Again, this big question that's behind it. And I decided from this paper that you couldn't use baboons to study humans.
Why?
That in fact, animal models are very flawed. This is still a great debate. Using primate models for human behavior really don't answer the questions. And so I just changed fields and became as I said, medical anthropologist. I decided I would study people and I would study their biology and health. So that was the first shift. So I go off to Costa Rica, where I did my field work. I worked in the medical system and in the folk medical system and worked with people in their homes for about 20 months. And at the end, I needed a job. And there weren't any jobs in anthropology at all. So I thought I would just stay in Costa Rica. I wasn't really ready to come home. That's a very typical anthropology attitude. And I got a call. I was back in a farm actually doing some interviews, and I got a telephone call at the main house. And it was this man whose name was Ian McCarg, who was this very famous urban planner and really genius. Who started the ecological planning movement, and he wanted to hire an anthropologist to teach in landscape architecture and regional planning. Now, I didn't even know what landscape architecture was, and I did know where Philadelphia was, but I had never been there, and but I needed a job, and I said, well, what am I going to be doing there? And he said, well, I want someone who will show us how the environment, I believe, he said, that ecologically sound about, this is, mind you, everyone, about 40 years ago, would create better health. And I want a medical anthropologist who will show us how health comes out of good cities and good planning and good design. He was definitely forward thinking, and in fact, very popular in the 1970s. And then there was this big turn away in the 80s, which is why I eventually left the design field. But the design fields, planning design, particularly urban planning and landscape architecture, but also architecture, kind of radical architecture to some degree, were already concerned with building environments that would improve the health, mental and physical health of people. And the promise of that was not clear. The evidence, the research had not yet been done, but there were people who really believed this. And indeed, I went to the University of Pennsylvania and I taught for 14 years in the design school, teaching design students essentially anthropology. And little by little, that changed me. That's why I said I needed a job. I needed the money. I was single and I needed I guess I felt I needed to get home. I needed to write my dissertation. I did that during the first 2 years. I don't recommend it. Writing and teaching at the same time. But 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 it had a lot to do with who I am today. That had I not gone to this department, I would never have gotten interested in space and place. I wouldn't have found this avenue for understanding the relationship between people in their environment through design, how we understand. And you can see by being in Latin America, I had learned a lot about inequality. I'm not sort of talking about that, but for a woman from sort of suburban California to see the kind of poverty you see in Latin America is eye-opening. I actually did go back and work in Guatemala for 5 years on why some children who are very poor were malnourished and others weren't. I mean, I still had that interest. So that I was already doing many things at the same time, but it was teaching for Ian McCarg, thinking, trying to satisfy his desire for me to prove that the good environment will produce health. And he is no longer with us, but my most recent work on public space does link health and mental well-being, but other forms of flourishing, including democracy and a healthy informal economy, to public space. So in a way, I finally answered his call. The only thing about teaching in a design school, which I still do, I still teach on the side at Pratt or go down to Penn, was that I was teaching students who wanted to use my knowledge and wanted me to teach the methodology, but I was not replicating myself. And at that time, there were only 3 anthropologists teach in design schools across, at least in the United States. I don't know that there was one in Canada. I actually don't know about in Europe. There were quite a few in Latin America. Latin America was much more socially oriented in terms of the kind of urban planning they do. They're more Marxist. But thinking about the city and including the social sciences was very big in the 70s, and there were a few of us here and there. But what starts happening by the 80s is there's really a change in design. There's a change in turning back to Beaux-Arts, turning back to models in art. Public money kind of dries up because of the economy. I did some research on that. And the work available was private. Large urban projects that had been very popular in the 70s turned into really private development by the late 80s, as we all know, with neoliberalism and urban restructuring, which I didn't understand at the time, but it was changing the entire landscape of these disciplines. And with that, those of us who are social scientists in the design fields felt that we had less and less impact, less and less purchase on what was happening. And we always thought it would turn around. I just never thought it would take 30 years. And it has turned around. Now, suddenly, there is so much interest in my work and in public space. And for the first time, design schools are thinking again of having social scientists. But in this interim period, social science heavily, except for economics, excuse me, but economics becomes the social science, but anthropology, environmental psychology, geography, even political science to some extent disappears where it had been, and the faculty with it. We all left. There was a core at University of Pennsylvania of us who would work together, and little by little, one person went here, one person left there. And I became interested in and concerned that I wasn't replicating myself. By that, I mean, I wasn't training other PhDs to do the kind of research I was doing and to do the kind of interventions. Because at this point, I'm teaching in studio, just like any other faculty member, but usually with a landscape architect, Bob Hanna, Laurie Olin, and usually a planner, maybe even an ecologist. And the students had the benefit of all of our perspectives. And I became interested in methodology, which is very prominent. I train students to do their own research in communities and bring back the data and design based on it. So that's where that came from. But when the turn away from people-based planning or community-based planning happens, I left. And I went to the Graduate Center of CUNY, where I still am. I was hired by the Department of Environmental Psychology, which was an interdisciplinary department. I was the only anthropologist, but there was two geographers, two psychologists, an architect, two planners. So we were interdisciplinary, and I joined them in the training of interdisciplinarily trained social scientists who focused on the built environment to some degree. And that's where I still am. And since I've been here, I have changed many times. The thing about the Graduate Center, I think that was the most important, is that it was really a hotbed of very radical urbanists. It included, we still have David Harvey, who is still with us, who's a world famous geographer who writes about the city and inequality. Neil Smith, who has passed away, was there. Sharon Zukin, who is now retired, also writes is a sociologist. Myself, Cindy Katz, who's a geographer, writes also about these, and others. And so we had this across the disciplines. Not just were we interdisciplinary inside environmental psychology, and that was very exciting, but across the different departments, little by little, I was in geography and anthropology and women's studies. You could be in all these departments, and as urbanists, we began to really influence one another and write one another, and almost created a kind of New York school. In the sense that we were quite political, saw the city as a place for resistance and contestation and protest, began to look at public space in this way, wrote critically about the move towards economic restructuring and urban development projects that excluded people and that, in fact, were exacerbating urban inequality. And I fit very well in there, and it influenced my writing and probably radicalized me more. And push me to answer bigger questions than maybe I was addressing while at Penn, while at the University of Pennsylvania. Move me from looking at the plaza to looking at the city, move me from, fine grain ethnography to trying to understand what that could tell us at a larger scale.
Yeah. And you mentioned now, Setha, that you work across sections and universities, but also countries, because tell me now how your story started with the Center for the Future of
Right.
Places.
Well, actually, it started, I guess, in 2014, I think, maybe even before, maybe even 2012. The Center for the Future of Places had this fantastic idea through funding from the Axon Johnson Foundation and the setting up of the Center for the Future of Places under Tigran Haas, that and now because I'm part of it, but we at this point,
Center.
The center wanted to influence the up and coming new urban agenda for the UN habitat, and wanted to have a really strong voice that included empirical research. I think that was the critical issue, that evidence-based planning and design and field research, hands-on research, not just quantitative research, that we could use to improve the world through influencing the UN documents, the new UN agenda, of having kind of a global impact using the knowledge that we had and getting it out there. And up to that time, in all honesty, I really had, I need to step back just a moment. Ian McCarr used to ask me all the time, Setha, I need one method. I need one method that will tell me everything I need to know to plan on and design for everyone. And it was sort of like Christopher Alexander. Will your guests know Christopher? Pattern language, or Mike Mahaffey also is interested. A pattern language that will predict and you can design on. Well, anthropologists are not into that at all. And I, in particular, wasn't. I mean, anthropologists in general tend to want to go to a place, would argue that culture is different and life is different everywhere, and that that you need to understand, you need to do research to understand how to design for any particular place, that no place are the people the same? Are the cultures the same? Is the environment is the same? Are the structures of meaning the same? Are the political issues the same? Are the structures of inequality, let's say, or even of oppression, are the same? So any one model would never be enough. And I used to fight with him, and he'd go, oh, my dear, you can do this. And I don't know. Anyhow, I refused to do it. And it was always a really sore thing with us, this disagreement. And yet, what starts happening, what I think it was really all about is, I think that I hadn't had enough experience to have any confidence that there was anything that we knew collectively that we could use. But what happens up until 2012, in that long period of my career, is I did tons and tons and tons of research. I worked all across the United States. I worked in the National Park Service in the US and the state New York system and the city system. I worked in Costa Rica and Panama. I worked in Canada. I worked not so much in Europe, but mostly in what I call the Americas. I always say I'm a New World girl, woman, a New World person, and I am. I'm most comfortable in the New World, the world that got quote unquote born, which it never was, late, excuse me. I mean that our history is indigenous and very different than Europe.
So how did you get in touch with the center?
Well, I think what they did is called me to come and be in one of these fantastic meetings that they had. I think that I got a call to come to Buenos Aires and give a talk. I don't know who knew about me. I don't know. I guess Tigran found me, and or maybe I called them, but I don't think so. I mean, I don't think so. But what happened is I went to the first meeting or the second meeting. I didn't go to the meeting in Sweden, but I did go to the second meeting in Buenos Aires, and gave a talk, and people really liked that talk a lot. I talked about social justice and threats to public space, and that was the beginning of a relationship. And from then on, they began to include me in the panels and the meetings that we had. Um, and at first, it was mostly to use the research that I'd already done. And then little by little, we began to plan interventions and research and methodologies and took on, of course, the database project. But the first few years we spent working on the new urban agenda and ultimately ending up in Quito, and having we had this incredible installation where we really talked to people from all over the world about our findings and about our key concepts. And we wrote a kind of mandate, or I think Luisa's calls hers a manifesto. I don't know what we called ours, key concepts, but we had certain ideas that we were really putting forward and as a group. And that was really a watershed moment. And then from there, we went to the World Urban Forum and got bigger and bigger. In the meantime, we also got involved in trying to put together all the social science research and design research that there was on public space. We really began to focus mostly on public space, not just the city in general, and began to develop, as a group, putting together this database project, which is about to be released, I think, to the public.
Yeah, that's lovely. And tell me now about your new book to the center, why public space matters. Tell me about the background, why you decide to focus on public spaces and so on.
Well, I think, I don't know the question to the public spaces, except that when I first went to Latin America, I was always struck by the plazas because everybody was there and talking to one another, and it was so lively and so full of interconnections. And you could see the whole country would be sort of in a microcosm in these central plazas. And I couldn't think of anything like that in the United States. I mean, I just couldn't. I guess I hadn't quite seen anything like that. And I became interested in the history and the archaeology. Remember, I was an archaeologist. So I wrote some papers about the history, that it's not just a European form of the plaza, but it's an indigenous form. That was an important thing to learn. It was from indigenous peoples as much as it was brought by the Spanish or and that there was a relationship, a synergy, a kind of urban planning form that happens between the Spanish. So that was the first public space. And I kept going back to the plaza while I was teaching landscape architecture, because I wanted to develop a method for Ian. And I felt that here's a place that I knew the culture already, and I spoke the language, and I had worked in Costa Rica for 17 years. So I could use that plaza as a model for how we could study space in general. And that was my first big intervention. So it wasn't, I had gone to it for methodological reasons, but it wasn't until I turned around and did research in gated communities, which was the next big sort of, if you think 15 years to do the plaza and 15 years in gated communities, which are the most private of spaces. And you realize what social relations are like in gated communities, which are terrible and not producing what they want at all, and create more fear, not less. And that here we are with more fear of others, and here the plaza is producing this very kind of open, seemingly democratic. I don't want to I'm not trying to romanticize it. So that's where the public space. So then after the gating, then I started study large parks and began to agree with the center. I mean, I guess that was their point of view, but I began to see how my work really just slid right into their work, but I hadn't seen it as such a big framework. But once I got in, I began to realize that public space. So you go all the way to the beginning. Public space produces health and well-being and mental health, which is amazing, all the way to the early part of my career, all the way back to the end, that my medical anthropology pops up, or my work on malnutrition and children's socialization in Guatemala. You can see how the public space, in fact, encourages children's socialization in public so that they can learn to be with others and share information and learn ways to be healthier and part of the society. So every piece of that early work on malnutrition and child development and health and mental well-being ends up back in why public space matters. I wrote the book. The book is still being written. We wish it were done. I must admit that COVID um, definitely offered challenges, because COVID changes public spaces in ways that we did not expect. And so I, it, I was writing, it's sort of half done, and COVID comes along, and I have to really reconceive the book in many ways, because COVID has shown us that public space matters even more than ever, or that it also can be frightening and create fear of others. And so that needed to be incorporated into it. But I wanted to write something that would take the database, the research I've done, ethnography, which is a different kind, this kind of ethnography of space and place that I had developed through other books that I'd written, and put it together for a broader public. And probably that's why the book is moving slowly. I haven't written for the public before, so to speak, but I'd like any person who isn't concerned about the closing of a park or the shutting down of streets, or deciding not to allow an open field to be there for soccer, to understand at a very basic level why it matters, why it is the very fiber of cities and underpins so many things, so many goods, that connecting people produces a kind of public culture and an atmosphere within which we can flourish in many ways. Politically, socially, economically, it's a place of work. Psychologically, it's a place of repose and also being together. And without those spaces, as we've learned during the COVID, we don't do as well, and that they are critical for our well-being, and that we take them for granted, at least in the United States. I think people take their public spaces for granted, make decisions about them for granted, and the current pressures of privatization and urban development and commercialization and consumption spaces and gentrification, all of these things work against having public spaces where everyone can be. And if we turn our public spaces into gated communities, in a sense, or segregate them in the way, I know where that ends. More fear of others. I know how it ends. So I felt like Why Public Space Matters, which will talk about what public space does that's positive. It will talk about, I have a section on what the threats are, what the opportunities are, and hopefully tell citizens what they can do about it.
Are there like case studies inside, diagrams?
they're pictures. I'm not a big diagram person. There are some diagrams. I have developed a theory of how it is that public space matters, the process. And there's a very important diagram that argues that we all, most of what is written and most of what you hear in journalism is public space is a place that we can encounter strangers. It's a place of contact. And there is this very important contact theory that's now 55 years old that argues that contact, be it in Sweden or the US or wherever it is, Costa Rica, that it's liberalizing in the sense of it increases tolerance. It actually produces creativity and all kinds of really positive qualities. Even if you don't talk to everyone, even if you don't engage with them, it has this kind of liberalizing impact on you. You see a broader world. But I've been really fascinated, but how does that get translated into something that changes a city? And a lot of people have written that just contact is enough. And I don't think that's quite the case. And so one of the diagrams or one of the main ideas is that contact needs to produce something I'm calling public culture. And I'm still looking for a better word. If you have one, I would really like it. Anyone out there, I'm still looking for a better word. But what I mean by that is think of your local park and think of interacting with people and think of how certain new rules and norms get built over time so that when you go, you have a sense of relationships. And if you want to be really inclusive, this public culture needs to also be built on things like recognition of difference and knowing that some people aren't going to be using the space the same way you are, but somehow that is okay. And it is I'm not saying it's not a rigid thing, but there is this kind of moving but flexible but sort of stable sense of how to be together in a place. And I feel that that is the very basis of democracy, of inclusiveness, of can be social justice, that without that, so that just contact, while it's liberalizing, unless it begins to take the form of a kind of public culture that then is part of the entire city, it circulates throughout the city, and that it's big enough to include counter publics and, expand the public sphere. That is a very crucial piece, and that's what we're reaching for. And I think conviviality is a term that is being used in Europe a lot. I don't know if it needs to be convivial, is the thing, because it could be about protest. The same kind of public culture occurs when people get together to protest something. There are ways in which we learn to treat each other in Occupy Wall Street or Black Lives Matter. In other words, it isn't always convivial. It could be arguing. It doesn't. In fact, that's probably even more powerful, to learn the edges of, so we can protest and we can hear each other. And then there's one more piece, which, again, I need a better term, I've called affective atmosphere. And taking this a little from Anna Barker, and who's at Leeds, though she doesn't develop it, or Ben Anderson, who's a geographer, just for our listeners. But the idea that this public culture takes place within a certain kind of atmosphere, and that atmosphere will in fact influence what can happen and what cannot happen. And I use the example of, you're in the Bronx and the Yankees have played at the Bronx Stadium. I hope I'm not being too New York centric, but you can imagine, and the Yankees win. What is it like in the parking lot and the streets? The streets are full of people honking, people are patting each other on the back, they're giving high fives, they're happy, talking to one another, crossing social groups, right? It's that event creates a kind of affective atmosphere within which certain kinds of behaviors and ways of being with others happen. And if they lose, what's it like? It's quiet. Nobody says anything. Everyone walks out separately. No high fives, no patting on the back, just kind of silence, right? And completely changes. And, all public spaces are like that. I mean, you can even think bigger during 9/11. How did that change the atmosphere? Anyhow, I'm arguing that those three things come together. You said tell you a little more about the book. So that's one of the diagrams, is to show how that really makes a difference. But the book is going to have tools, the tests, the toolkit for the ethnographic study of space. It's going to have cases, I guess, in the sense each chapter will have an ethnographic example. More than anything, the examples and the cases, they're not quite cases, they're summaries of ethnographies that either I've done or my colleagues have done, and will show how these ideas, how public space translates into these benefits. In other words, how is it that a space creates health or well-being? And I want to show you people who are in a space, who created a new space, and how they're responding to it, so you can see how it happens. That's really fundamentally what the book is about.
And Seth, I have a question in my mind now. You're teaching landscape architecture and teaching your students how to transform data to like concrete elements, design elements. So what makes a good public space? Like, what is there a recipe that create a good public space? Like, what are the elements that makes a good public space?
I think that I mean, Project for Public Space has their own recipe. Many of us are trying to be really critical of that, because it's a recipe for making money, for making a center of the city lively, whether or not. The recipe for a good public space, as far as I'm concerned, is one that creates a socially just public space. And a socially just public space, uh, I have come up, and I think it's too hard for a podcast, but I think you need to look at various kinds of justice to know whether you have a good public space. And you'll have to ask certain kinds of questions. So you might ask, under distributive justice, is there public space for everyone in the city? Or even within a neighborhood, is there public space for everyone who needs public space? Kind of a distributive justice question. So it wouldn't be a perfect good, but you'd first ask the question, is there space for everyone, or only for some, which is what we find? Are the ways in which we interact in those spaces, is there interactional justice? Is there recognition of difference? Is there, in this building of public culture, are all kinds of cultural norms included and respected? Is there care? Can people care for the environment? Can people care for each other? These are all, for me, are there procedures by which groups can get access to the public space? Is there what we call informational justice? Are people told the truth about what's kind of going on? To me, what makes a good public space at this point in my career is not just that it's culturally diverse, which is where I started. It used to be, if it's culturally diverse, if everybody is there, if it's really for all, it's a good public space. And that was my answer. I've been criticized for that, but now I think I have to go further. I almost think I'm trying to figure out it's got to have diversity, difference, which means recognition of difference, and democracy or social justice. And if those three things are there, if there is diversity, recognition of difference, democracy in the sense of the ability to protest, the ability to fight, as well as to cooperate, to collaborate as well, that's sort of what I mean by democracy, both at the micro scale and the other, then it's a good public space. Good public space is socially just public space. And from that, everything else will come.
Mm-hmm. Now I have, in Urbanistica podcast, I talk a lot about smart city, future cities, and so on. And lately we started to see virtual public spaces, the digital when you
Right.
put
Yeah, I
the
do. I'm going to teach a class on it.
yeah,
I'm really
yeah. So
fascinated.
now I would love to hear from you. What do you think? What is your reflection about these virtual public spaces?
Okay. Okay, I'm thinking a lot about it. And as I said, the way I work on something is teach a class on it. I'm teaching it in the fall. Right now, I'm teaching something called critical remote ethnography, which is how to study public space essentially remotely, digitally, but also using photographs and film and Instagram and YouTube, but how to do it critically, how to understand self-representations. Anyhow, I don't know, again, if you're interested in that, I'll go, but let me just say two things. One, smart public spaces are mostly right now being used in order to implement economic and financial goals, profit making.
You mean digital public spaces?
Not digital. I'm just saying smart. Hudson Yards in New York is a smart public space that has all kinds of monitors and technologies in it. I'm starting there. You first did smart because I think it's what's really important. And I think that smart public space has promise ecologically, like we all hoped. But the truth of the matter is, as long as it's used by developers only for profit-making means and for advertising, then the technology will only replicate the same structures of power that were there before the technology. Do you follow me? So where smart technology in public space, in other words, is working, is where it's really done in the public interest, not to gather data or to control or to surveil. So, and I think that's the answer to the smart city. I'm quite concerned about all this surveillance and its ends. So and it starts with a public space for me. I mean, I don't have to look at the whole city. I can look at Hudson Yards and I can tell you where the data is going and what they're doing with it, and or that they won't tell you what they're doing with all this, and that you think that you're getting Wi-Fi, but instead you can get Wi-Fi at the kiosk, but that also means they know who you are and what you're buying, and then they sell things to you. I mean, this isn't, to me, the way to go. Virtual public space, the reason I wanted to give myself a minute to think about it. I think virtual public space is really important. There is no question that it has saved lots of people through COVID. And virtual public space is real. I think we have to stop thinking that there is real and not real space. There is nothing not real about the virtual. I mean, there is real virtual as well as sort of imaginary virtual. I mean, I think that we need to think about the digital and the not digital. Maybe I like the word physical, really, the physical and the digital worlds as hybrid. I do think we're living in hybrid worlds. How can we not, when I'm talking to you over Zoom and we're being mediated by a private company that is deciding on the quality, and and how can you not say that's real? My representation to you is through the internet. It's digital. Yes, I'm not really there. Okay. So I think that the future of digital public space is going to be important, especially in a world like we're in now with COVID. On the other hand, I have been attending lots and lots of workshops seen other listened to other researchers and doing my own research, that there is definitely a difference between virtual public space and what can happen and physical public space. And I and where they intersect, I think, is very interesting. You know, protests using digital public space to get people together on Facebook, to get them to, you know, it's through Facebook. You know, imagine Facebook as a place. You know, it's a place, and that people come together and then they move to the real place. You cannot separate it, right? So the question is, what do I think? But at the same time, I think the evidence is also showing us that there is something about being with people physically, embodied, is different than not being embodied. That the smell, sound, body senses of people are important. And we don't know how important, except that during COVID, people have suffered so much, even when they had virtual public spaces. And this is what I'm now going to study and I think this is really important. Early in my work, the medical anthropology and the baboons. I have always thought that embodied space was important. I'm a swimmer, and you can't get in the pool and swim without thinking. I don't know how, if you're a swimmer, you know what I'm talking about. If you're not a swimmer or a dancer, that the body has knowledge that is not mind. We are mind body connected, and we are very sensory, and we are animals. And that, I think, what we have to tease out of the virtual public space versus physical space, I'm calling them both real. Do you understand? I mean, I'm not saying one is real and one is not, because I'm uncomfortable with that. I think they're both real. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand.
They're both real places. But certain things can only occur in one and the other. I can't be having this conversation with you in person because you're in Sweden without me flying. All right. And I think that's very beneficial. On the other hand, we would feel very differently about each other if we were in the same room. This conversation would be different. It would affect my body. The affective atmosphere would be different. And and people who've been studying religion have found, like, going to church online versus, or going to a synagogue or going to a mosque, I'm not, is very different. Especially in Russia. There's some great research in Russia, because Greek Orthodox Church, you don't sit, you all stand, and it's tons of smells and sounds and talking, and it's really physical. And so you can watch it and do it in your home alone, but the experience of it is profoundly different. And what we do not know, and that I am absolutely passionate to find out, and don't know that I will have time in my life, is what is that difference? And does it really matter? And how much does it matter? What kinds of social ties can we create virtually? Obviously, very strong ones for many people. Unfortunately, I'm not a millennial, which means I haven't lived half my life with that being my way of socializing. My experience on Facebook or Twitter is much more mechanical. I don't really check. I mean, I tweet a lot, and but I don't engage with a lot. I've been trying to do Reddit and follow Reddit groups. And I'm teaching a course where we're going to do research on Facebook groups. So I'm learning a lot more. But just because of my generation, I'm not as embedded as someone. So I can't be the one to judge how important those relationships are. I can certainly see that they create relationships because of what happened on January 6th. Those relationships writ large, or Tahrir Square, or Occupy, or Black Lives Matter. Those communities are communities, they're real. But what is the sensation of all being together in physical space versus virtual space? I don't think we
Yeah.
yet know.
I think,
And I think it'll be different.
yeah, and I think you really explain the the virtual and the physical and how they come together and not separated. And now I would love to ask you about your book. When do you think you will be done and
Be
published?
out. It was supposed to be done right. It was supposed to be finished writing today. And
Today.
I had today, yes, today. It's really sad, but it's half done. So, as I said, COVID has slowed all of us down. It really has had an impact on all of us. And teaching online has been hard. And I had to rethink the book because of current things. There's no point in writing a book when the whole world turns upside down and not involving yourself in that. And makes it tricky. But it'll probably be finished in another 6 months. I mean, you know, but certainly by the end of the year, and it will be out in 2022.
Yeah, lovely. So I'm happy that we had this chat, and I'm very inspired. And I think you opened many new doors for us to think what is public space and why it's matter. And I would love that now when we're gonna finish this episode, that you give us the listeners 3 takeaway messages.
I know. That's. Let's see. I'm not good at this. Good public space is socially just public space, and it is possible for us to design, create, and fight for more socially just, which means equitable and inclusive, accessible for all. That means ability, gender, race, class, culture, sexual orientation. I think that's really an important piece for the future. 2, that we need to stop seeing the virtual public space and physical public space as antithetical, but to understand, I guess, their synergies. Because again, that's going to be the future. And if we're going to create an inclusive and just world, we have to take on the virtual, and there are issues. I think there are issues with privatization and corporate control. We didn't go into them, but you're asking me for a takeaway, not just from my research, but things I'm thinking about for the future. I think we have to pay attention. And your question about, is it different? I think we need to understand what the differences are. I think it's going to be critical to societies, all societies, to understand the differences. And as human beings and as cyborgs, as we're hybrids. Even in the poorest nations, people are attached to their phone or some kind of prosthetic. In fact, the increase in communication in the world has been through this infrastructure, this new infrastructure. And 3, public space matters for so much, and that it provides an infrastructure for all cities to have the kinds of social, economic, financial, political goods that we all wish for all people. And that by really attending to our public spaces in a serious way, taking them seriously, treating them seriously, funding them, understanding them, researching them, making them better, making them more just, that we can transform cities, essentially from the neighborhood up, necessarily from the smart down. Whether or not we use technology, as I said, because that would be my 4th, that technology does not solve inequality or the structural elements, the pieces that structure our societies and worlds. And technology will only exacerbate it. So it doesn't make our struggle for understanding that go away.
That's amazing. And you told me that you didn't prepare for these messages? So the last question is gonna be you asking us, the listeners, one question.
can each of you do to contribute to the public spaces in your world? Can you go out and try to understand them better? Can you try to figure out if your local is unjust? Can you even enlist yourself in trying to begin to promote it? Because to have the kind of world I'm imagining, I need all of you.
Very interesting question. Well, thank you so much, Setha, for the really good and interesting conversation. I'm happy to talk to you.
Thank you so much.
And hopefully see you in Stockholm.
I hope I'm vaccinated, so I'm ready to roll.
Nice. So soon, hopefully soon.
Soon.
Yeah.
Take care. Thank you so much. Thank you to the center. I'm really excited to see this podcast come out and see if people answer me.
Sure. Thank you. So let's say see you in Stockholm.
Okay. See you in Stockholm.
Bye.
Bye.
Hey. Well, thank you so much for listening to Urbanistica podcast. I hope you really enjoyed this episode. You learned something new and also got inspired by the guest. Don't forget to share the episode on your social media and recommend it to people you think they are really interested in this topic. Thank you so much again for giving your valuable time to Urbanistica podcast. I am Mustafa Sharif. Keep up the good work. Keep loving cities.